Hi, my name is Erin.
My name's Justin.
And I'm James.
Today we are going to be talking about reform regarding mentally ill offenders and prison overcrowding. Our criminal justice system isn't without flaw. In fact, there are many areas where reform could be implemented for improvement. Although there are many programs, policies, and processes that could be updated to run more adequately, the topic of mentally ill offenders in the system is a highly controversial issue. Should mentally ill offenders be charged for their crimes if mens rea isn't present? Should they be processed in-house in correctional facilities as those of sound mind are? Is there a better way of ensuring their medication and treatment plans are being met? Do rehabilitation and reentry programs work for mentally ill offenders? These are only a few of the many unanswered questions regarding the mentally ill in our criminal justice system. There are two parts to a crime, actus rea and mens rea. Actus rea is the physical act committed by the accused, while mens rea refers to the state of the mind statutorily required in order to convict a defendant of a crime. The criminal justice system has these two elements of a crime to differentiate whether an offender intentionally set out to commit a crime or if they committed the crime without intent. In order to be on a jury, you must be of sound mind. In order to witness, oh my God, I'm so sorry. In order to be a witness in court, you must be of sound mind. And in order to stand trial, you must also be of sound mind. So why do mentally ill offenders take up such a huge portion of our correctional facilities? I believe there are better alternatives for mentally ill offenders than to be thrown into the general population of prisons and jails. Those who suffer from mental illnesses are actually more likely to be a victim of a crime or to self-harm. Their overrepresentation in the criminal justice system results from their poor ability to communicate with law enforcement officers, lack of adequate legal representation, self-medicating with drugs and alcohol, having an episode in public, and simply a lack of anywhere to place them. A Florida judge pointed out jails are the one institution that can't say no to admitting someone, so the mentally ill are dumped there, often without treatment, and then have a criminal record to boot. One option of reform would be if law enforcement officers and correctional facility officials were trained better on how to identify offenders with mental illnesses and have them stand trial in a mental health court. This will assure those with mental illnesses aren't simply pushed through the regular court system and tried unfairly. It's not uncommon for a patrol officer to receive a call asking that a person with a mental illness be removed from a place of business. If this person doesn't leave or has an episode, they will be taken to jail. If it is made known they are mentally ill, they could be tried in a special court system such as the mental health court. One controversy over mental health court is that many criminals plead insanity to receive a lesser sentence when they are not mentally ill and were aware of their actions during the commission of a crime. It is up to the mental health court to decide if the accused was or is mentally ill and how they should be charged. These courts understand mental illnesses and the way they affect actions and behavior. If the crime is minimal, it's possible for a person with a mental illness to divert the charge while receiving treatment for their illness. However, not every person with a mental illness will be allowed a diversion, and it's up to the courts to decide their sentence. Another option of reform would be institutionalizing mentally ill offenders rather than incarcerating them. Although the cost of mental health facilities is outrageous, our court system spends a large amount of money with each offense and offender. If the offender is being treated for their illness, perhaps it will prevent reoffense. In mental health facilities, people are offered personalized treatment options based on their illness. Doctors, therapists, and nurses make sure the mentally ill receive the care and medication they need. This could be one-on-one therapy, anger management courses, medication trials, educational programs, etc. Mental health care is now in the spotlight due to the public outcry regarding gun violence. However, the mentally ill are still not receiving the treatment they need. Instead, they are being left in prisons and jails. Amanda Pustelnik, Associate Professor of Law at University of Maryland and an expert on the relationship of law, neuroscience, and mental health policy, states, "Today, our largest mental hospitals are our jails. The jail at New York's Rikers Island functions as the nation's largest psychiatric facility. Los Angeles jails, not hospitals, are California's largest provider of mental health care. State prisons alone spend nearly $5 billion annually to incarcerate mentally ill inmates who are not violent. And according to the Department of Justice, nearly 1.3 million people with mental illnesses are incarcerated in state and federal jails and prisons, compared to only about 70,000 people being served in psychiatric hospitals. One of the biggest issues for those with mental illnesses in correctional facilities is they are not receiving medication and treatment as they would if they were institutionalized in a mental health facility. Correctional officers are not trained as therapists or doctors and do not have the education or understanding of mental illnesses required to appropriately meet the needs of the mentally ill. Training or hiring staff specifically for meeting the needs of the mentally ill would be a great first step towards reformation. More funding and resources need to be available for the mentally ill in our criminal justice system. Otherwise, more mentally ill offenders will end up back in jail or prison and likely locked in solitary confinement.
There are many problems that the mentally ill deal with in prisons, but arguably the worst part they deal with is solitary confinement. Currently, there are more than 4,000 prisoners with severe mental illness. They are being held in solitary confinement in U.S. prisons, according to new research done by the Yale Law School. In a survey conducted by the Yale Law researchers, together with the Association of State Correctional Administrators, has revealed of these 4,000, many spend up to 22 hours a day and sometimes 15 consecutive days, or sometimes more, in solitary confinement. Also, the Yale Law School found that most states in America are holding mentally ill individuals in isolation. Of the 33 states that responded to the survey with details, only one state, Texas, said it had no such inmates in solitary confinement. In a 2014 study that the New York City's jail system did, for instance, found that the prevalence of self-harm among inmates held in isolation was 7 times of that of those in general population. The evidence of harm is so well established that the American Correctional Association has issued standards forbidding states from holding mentally ill prisoners in isolation cells, also known as segregation, for prolonged periods. Some states have made strides in reducing or even eliminating the use of solitary confinement for mentally ill prisoners. Colorado has a new rule where if a prisoner is found to have psychological or other problems, they are immediately redirected to treatment rather than segregated lockup. Colorado is one of the success stories contained in the Yale and ASCA report. In 2017, it became the first and only state in the U.S. to ban the practice of holding prisoners in isolation cells for longer than 15 days. And now let's take a break and discuss why prisoners are put in solitary confinement in the first place. If they are seen as dangerous, like serial killers or prisoners that are in for more heinous crimes, they will be put straight into solitary confinement. If they pose a threat to themselves, staff, or other inmates, they will be put into solitary confinement. And one last reason would be for punishment. This would be anywhere from getting in a fight with other prisoners or sneaking in contraband and selling it to other prisoners. Prisoners who are mentally ill and receiving inadequate treatment find it very difficult to follow the strict rules of prison, where even the most mentally sound inmates find it difficult to avoid rule violations. In South Carolina, not only are their mentally ill more likely to be placed in solitary confinement, they often find it exceedingly difficult to meet the requirements to be released back into general prison population. Most challenges to solitary confinement have been brought under the 8th Amendment ban against cruel and unusual punishment. The Americans with Disabilities Act offers an individual, unique statutory path for mentally ill inmates. Prisons across the country range in the severity of their solitary confinement, providing different access to programming and overall time spent in isolation from the general population in solitary confinement. But the ADA may encourage improvement of these policies with the practices set in place and some reformed institutions serving as a model for other institutions to follow suit. The vast majority of individuals subject to solitary confinement react negatively and exhibit symptoms of declining mental health, so if they do not get the right treatment while in solitary confinement, their conditions will worsen. There was a mentally ill inmate at a Nebraska state prison who spent the majority of his sentence in solitary confinement. The story drew national attention because he committed 4 murders just over a week after his release. He was released directly from solitary back into society, despite his request to be sent to a psychiatric facility. So even he asked to get more help before he went back out into the real world. Inmates who are released from solitary confinement are more likely to recidivate than their counterparts released from general population. In response, prisons throughout the country are being forced to rethink their use of solitary confinement and treatment of mental illnesses. So what are the reform options? I think there are many options for reform. The first thing we could do is to eliminate solitary confinement for mentally ill prisoners in its entirety. And if you can't eliminate it, then reduce the time spent and how many days you can spend in solitary confinement. Next, we need to have them go through programs to reintegrate them into society if they're coming straight from solitary confinement. We also need to get the mentally ill the right treatment they need to get through their sentence. One last thing is we need to always make sure that they are taking their medication.
Overpopulation in prisons has been a very contributing issue in America. Today, state prisons house 1,362,025 people. 237,000 are coming from drugs, 185,800 coming from robbery, 166,700 from murder, 146,500 from assault, 130,000 from burglary, 142,500 public order, and 353,228 from other. This all comes from Audrey Williams, the writer of The Prison Overcrowding Threatens Public Safety and State Budget. As you can see on my next slide, more than 2.4 million people fill up the state and federal prisons, juvenile facilities, and jails. Of these, 688,000 are released back into society each year. This adds up to almost 12 million people who cycle through local jails each year, revealing an enormous jail churn, says Williams. 430,000 of these inmates are awaiting trial. I'll be talking about the trial and why there's so many people waiting later in my next slides. Almost 15,000 children remain behind bars. Most of these, whose most serious crimes may involve technical violations and fragments related to their probation and parole, and over 3,000 children are on status offenses. The U.S. Department of Justice states that these status offenses behaviors are not law violations for adults. These could be running away, truancy, and incorrigibility. A study from the state of Washington found that incarcerating chronic, violent offenders does provide a public benefit in society safety, but increasing the imprisonment of non-violent offenders leads to a negative return. Much of the other overcrowding can lead to riots and other dangerous situations. After a riot in Delaware, 100 guards quit or retired early. On February 1st, 2007, a group of inmates held 4 correctional officers hostage that lasted 18 hours. During the standoff, 1 officer died and many others were injured. In another riot that occurred in the same prison, a female officer was held hostage and raped. She was later killed after a 7-hour standoff, says Gabby Galvin from her article, Underfunded, Overcrowded State Prisons Struggling with Reform. I have a friend that works at the correctional facility in Saline County, and he says he's in a room full of 40 to 50 inmates to his single self. Sometimes this may get a little scary. 5 months after the riot situation in Delaware, no charges were added to these convicts. They were given solitary confinements. They were deprived of their medical care and no contact with visitors such as family or friends. Stephen Hampton, an attorney, has been fighting the state 15 years on behalf of the prisoners. Galvin added that most prisons like these are ran poorly due to a lack of officers. As you can see in this slide, Jerry Jelly, a retired correctional officer in Delaware, states, "Until you get jail properly manned, inmates aren't going to get what they need." In my next slide, you'll see the number has jumped tremendously in the past years of population in jails in the U.S. A lot of these offenders sit in jail because they can't afford to cash bond to get out. Keith Humphrey, in his article, "Why America's Jails Are So Overcrowded," states, judges are less willing than in later previous eras to release individuals charged with crimes on their own recognizance. Instead, judges more commonly set cash bail amounts that many defendants can't pay. These consequences can be life-threatening. The key contributing factor to these are poor conditionings around the world. Solitary confinement is being used to hold people, 80,000 people in the United States. 22 national prison systems hold more than double their capacity. Most prisons do not have a minimum space requirement by international standards. This means that these inmates are having to sleep anywhere on the ground or with other people. Better training for these officers, bigger jails, prisons, and nonviolent criminals can be a reform to this option. In conclusion, for the mentally ill in solitary confinement, we need to make sure that they are getting the right treatment they need if you cannot avoid solitary confinement. The other big point is that there needs to be more programs for individuals that go straight from solitary confinement to the society. Overpopulation has been a huge factor in the United States. With an increase in the population of inmates, it takes a toll on officers and inmates. Overcrowding can lead to riots and other dangerous situations. More training for law enforcement, bigger jails and prisons, and less time for nonviolent criminals could be a solution for jails and prisons.